Perception might as well be reality in politics. It's why the thousand-strong anti-racism protests in the middle of a pandemic were a bad idea, for the cause and the government, as New South Wales has recognised. It's why inbound quarantine exemptions for celebrities and millionaires like Danny Minogue and Kerry Stokes contrast so badly with a general population suffering in lockdown, and it's why giving public servants a pay rise at a time when many government services remain unavailable or inaccessible can only widen the growing divide between two Australias. Those with government-backed jobs and the people in the private sector who normally fund those public servants, but have seen real cuts in income across the board, sometimes to zero. Something else we've learnt over the course of this second wave is that locking people down is significantly less effective than government hardheads and the perpetually terrified would like to believe. Victoria's Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton agrees, claiming that the stage 4 restrictions that the media are constantly badgering Daniel Andrews about would have little effect on community transmission that's happening primarily in Victorian workplaces. Unless the Premier literally stops people from showing up at the office, which would be his most draconian step yet, further authoritarian measures won't have any impact on this coronavirus transmission vector. It's also revealed the serious shortcomings of an increasingly casualised 21st century workforce, with no sick leave entitlements for most lower income workers, forcing them to choose between their family's financial security and well-being and the health and risks to everyone around them. What a horrible choice to have to make in one of the richest countries on the planet. Metropolitan Melbourne has been locked down for almost 20 days now, with some northwestern suburbs and the Housing Commission towers ring-fenced for even longer. Considering the virus has an average incubation period of about 5 days, but potentially as long as 2 weeks, we've now been in lockdown for multiple generations of transmission, yet our case numbers continue to rise. We've been forced to wear masks not just in crowded spaces, but every time we leave the house, under threat of financial penalty from public servants that have received a pay rise. Victorians have been banned from leaving not only their state, but their city and in some cases even their suburb, as people travelling solo to surf or ride or run have been hit with fines of more than $1,600. Every major sporting event has left the state, and health authorities are actively encouraging all of us to report our neighbours to the police if they get out of line, say by ordering a lot of food, destroying the fabric of communities and breeding suspicion and fear. The only refrain, and it's a social media trope at this point, is that these measures are just temporary, which is the same thing, incidentally, people were saying in March. It's only a month or two, stop complaining. Now, quite apart from the fact that freedoms removed are almost never reinstated in full, here we are almost 6 months later, watching our short time on this earth drift away as our home state transforms from the cultural and economic heart of this nation into little more than a prison labour camp. You can go to work and then you can go home, which is not all that different from 230 years ago, I guess. Meanwhile, the Premier proclaims we'll be living with these temporary restrictions for, and I quote, a very long time to come. He's proven himself as one of the greatest political operators of the modern day in getting Victorians to blame their neighbours and each other for a government quarantine breach that, according to genome sequencing, is responsible for the entire second wave. Meanwhile, the rest of the country, and indeed the world, gets on with life whilst protecting the most vulnerable members of society. They're already playing cricket again in the UK, one of the hardest hit nations on earth. California, Texas, Arizona and Florida are all experiencing a second wave as they reopen their societies, but they're mirroring Victoria's experience with significantly lower mortality rates and plenty of capacity left in the hospitals, despite higher rates of infection than the first wave. This is the definition of a flatten the curve strategy, and one can only hope that reports of Andrew's desire for caseloads in the single digits before he even contemplates drip feeding our freedoms back to us are overblown by the same hyperactive media that's at least as responsible for instilling this fear as authoritarian political actors. So just remember the real enemy. It's not each other, it's a virus. Remember the many medical exemptions from wearing a mask before you berate the person walking past you on the footpath or standing in the queue at Safeway. But most importantly, remember that most bureaucrats and many politicians desire a zero-risk society, which is fine if all you want to do is go to work and watch Netflix, but it's not and never has been a reasonable or realistic MO for a free society in the pursuit of happiness.